Chapter 14. Lift it! Steel shouted the words like a command. Lead seized the heavy sheet of glass and swung it up from the top of the cabinet. Sapphire was waiting in the hallway with Helen as Steel and Lead came out from the kitchen. Steel's face was tense. "It's gone," he announced. "The patch of light has gone." There was no surprise on Sapphire's face, only a look of seriousness that matched the expression of Steel's. "And I think I know where it's gone," she said, as she turned to face the cellar door. Moving on instinct, Lead hit the cellar door in the same way that he had gained entry to the office. The cellar door caved inwards under the impact. Rob and his father were halfway across the cellar, moving around boxes and cases and old pieces of furniture, when one stray thought, perhaps triggered by what seemed the faraway sound of the breaking door, entered Rob's mind. I've been down here a lot of times since you and Mum disappeared," he said. But his father did not answer as they threaded their way through the cellar towards the end section. "So, why haven't I seen you?" "Seen us?" his father asked, still leading Rob by his hand. "Yes. Why haven't I seen you? I mean, there aren't that many places to hide down here." "No places, no. But there are ways." "Ways?" Rob asked sleepily. "Ways of hiding. I'll show you." Sapphire's voice echoed through the narrow alleyways of the cellar. "Rob!" And then Steel's voice. "Rob!" Some reflex made Rob halt as the voices floated through his tired mind, like the voices of faceless people in a dream. "Are you down there, Rob?" His father tightened the grip on his hand. "Don't listen to them," he whispered. "We'll soon be safe." Helen had to be told to sit at the top of the cellar steps and to stay there while Steel, Sapphire and Lead made their way down the steps to the cellar itself. They peered through at the darkness, Sapphire glancing back to check on Helen as they looked and listened and exercised their senses. The end section of the cellar was darker still. There were no gratings here to provide even a dim light. A crossbeam and two upright sunken beams formed a kind of arch that led to the end section and the bare blank wall beyond. The wall that was the very end of the house. Rob's father led the way to the beams and then stopped. "Where is she?" Rob peered lazily into the darkness beyond the beams. "Where's Mum?" Rob's father said nothing. "I can't see her," said Rob. "Look." His father pointed towards the shadowy end wall of the house. "There she is." In the corner of the end section, a dark shape seemed to detach itself from the matching darkness. Rob stared through tired eyes. He could just about define the shape as the shadowed figure of a woman. But her head was lowered, and it was turned away from him. Her long hair hung down like dark curtains. "Mum?" Rob said, smiling a weary but pleased smile. "Hello, Rob," murmured the dark shape, its head still lowered, still turned away. "There you are," Rob's father said, moving towards the beams, towards the dark shape, taking Rob with him. Again, some hidden reflex, the same tiny scrap of spirit that had made Rob question his mother's voice at the attic room door, nagged away inside him. And so he held back from the beams that seemed to lead nowhere. The grip was tightened on Rob's hand as his father asked, "Come on, you wanted to see her, didn't you?" "Yes, but—" "But what?" Rob tried to focus his eyes on the dark shape that resembled his mother, and yet chose to look away. "Well, why doesn't she look at us?" Rob's father stood there for a moment, as if to consider the question. He then spoke to the figure. "Yes, dear. Why won't you look at us?" The figure raised its head very slowly, and then turned its body equally slowly to face Rob. The figure had no face, no features. There was only a darkness under the strands of hair where a face should have been. Just a blackness, a nothingness. Rob screamed loudly, and the tiredness suddenly left him. But it was far too late. Whatever this thing was that pretended to be his father, it was dragging him past the beams and into the end section of the cellar. At the sound of the scream, Steel, Sapphire and Lead ran quickly through the cluttered passageways of the cellar. When they eventually reached the arched support beams and were ready to move on past them, Sapphire stopped suddenly, her arms extended like a barrier. "Wait!" Steel and Lead waited. Just there. Sapphire's hands moved, testing the area around the beams. Beyond those wooden beams. Steel nodded and took half a pace forward. "We're all right as far as the beams?" he asked. "Yes." "What about the beams themselves?" said Steel, taking another half pace forward. "No!" Steel checked himself in mid-action and moved back one pace, watching Sapphire as he did so. "It's where it starts," said Sapphire. "Somewhere." "In the beams?" "Somewhere." Sapphire was still testing. "Here, somewhere. These beams are a part of it." Steel nodded, and Sapphire relaxed and moved back slightly from the archway of beams. Moving from one side of the cellar wall to the other, Steel studied the space between the beams as if he were looking closely at some invisible texture. He then looked beyond the wooden supports and into the end section. Rob was not there. Neither was his father, nor the shadowed figure. Steel waited for a moment and then called, "Rob?" Yes, Steel," Rob's voice answered back from the empty section of the cellar. The moment that Rob had been pulled past the beams, things had changed abruptly. He had found himself alone and in full command of his senses. He also felt very lost and frightened. He had immediately realized that he was no longer in the house. He was outside somewhere, but where? It was still night, and he had looked around him as far as he could see on a night that was quite cloudy with very little moonlight. The wind blew in, unbroken, across what seemed to be open land, and Rob had recognized it as the very same wind coming in from the bay that blew ceaselessly past the house. But the house was not there anymore. Then, adjusting to the darkness, he had looked at the ground around his feet. He had then found that he was standing on a flagstone floor that was surrounded by a comparatively shallow rectangular trench. There were a few rough building stones set into the trench, and, here and there, some pegs and posts set out like markers. Then he had looked up and seen the two upright beams, freshly hewn and fixed temporarily into place. And the night air was different. It smelled and tasted somehow clearer. He had kept his position, the same position that he had been in when the image of his father and the shadowed figure had vanished, leaving him there alone, because he knew that to stay exactly as he was standing was important. But he had moved his head. He had wanted to try to look out towards Scar's Edge. The lights of the village could always be seen reflected against the night sky, especially when there was low cloud. So he had moved his head carefully. He then saw, close at hand, some old, heavy-looking building tools and a wheelbarrow that resembled a wooden tub. He had then looked out in the direction of Scar's Edge. The wind was the same, and so was the faint sound of the sea. But there were no comforting lights at a distance. Scar's Edge was not there. And then he had realized why he was outside in the night air. The village of Scar's Edge had probably not been thought of yet. And his house, the old house that he lived in, was only just about to be built. He had then moved his head back quickly and maintained his original position. He was very frightened, and had been relieved to hear Steel's voice so close at hand. I know what to do, Steel, he called out to the night air. Steel's voice answered, still close by. Tell me, Rob. Well, this is what happened to Sapphire, isn't it? Like on the landing. Yes. So I know what to do, Steel. I just stand very still, don't I? There was no answer, and Rob felt a sudden surge of panic. Don't I? He called out again, louder this time. Steel's voice answered quickly. Yes, Rob, you do. And that's good. That's very good, Rob. You're doing the right thing. And Rob smiled a little nervously. Just a pleased smile to himself. Being praised by Steel, that was something. Then, calling out again, he said, I'm sorry, Steel, but it was my father. Your father? Steel's voice came back to him through the fresh, clear air. Yeah, he brought me down here, down into the cellar. Well, not really him. A moment passed, as if Steel was busy thinking things out back there in the proper time. And Rob wanted to be there. He was sorry that he had mistrusted them. He was sorry for so many things. And yet he felt that he had tried his best in his own way. Whatever it was that was pretending to be your father, said Steel's voice, is it with you now? Rob sensed some anxiety in the voice. No, he called back. I'm alone here. Once again, Steel answered quickly. You're not alone, Rob. No, Rob whispered. Did you hear that? Yes. You're quite close to us, Rob. It was Sapphire's voice this time. Yes, Sapphire. Sapphire spoke again. We're all here in the cellar, and you're one of us. Then Lead spoke, the deep voice booming its reassurance. Yes, you're with us, boy. You're right here with us. And Rob felt the cool wind blowing in across this open, alien landscape. 200 years back in time, and he was there like something that did not belong, something that was not protected, like a caged bird let loose into a vast open territory that it did not know and was not equipped for. And everything, the fear, the hurt, the anxiety for his parents, plus the confusion and the false, fake hopes, all seemed to shift uncontrollably inside him. Rob began to cry. Steel and Sapphire, watched by Lead, stood in the dark cellar and listened to the sound of Rob crying. Beckoning to Sapphire, Steel turned away so that he could not be heard by the unseen Rob. Is he in danger? Steel asked quietly. Yes, Sapphire nodded, keeping her voice low. He's in great danger. Steel looked at her, then glanced back at the wooden beams and the empty, shadowy section of the cellar. Lead had heard. He watched them, a set look on his face. You see, he's not really alone in there, Sapphire whispered. Something's in there with him. It was a moment or two before Steel moved back to face the wall again. Rob, he called. Yes, Rob spoke, swallowing hard, trying to hide his tears. Can you describe where you are to me? Without moving from your position, can you do that? Yes, said Rob. I've already looked. And I'm in the cellar. The end of the cellar. Well, part of it, I suppose. Part of it? Yes, it's the cellar, but it isn't finished. Steel looked at Sapphire, then at Lead, then back to the arched beams. It's being built, Rob's voice spoke out from the emptiness once more. It's the house, but it isn't here yet. It's being built, only just being built. I can see the foundations. There's no one here. It's night time, you see. They must have all gone home. All right, Rob, said Steel. Now just be patient, will you? Yes, was the choked reply. There's no need to cry, and there's no need to worry. I'm not crying, Rob's voice said quickly. Good. Now, just be patient and leave it to us. Steel then turned to Lead. The other child, he said. "She's still on her own." Led nodded and ambled back down the cellar passageways towards the stairs, ducking his head under the low sections of ceiling as he went. Steel had turned to Sapphire once more. "The house being built," he asked quietly, "why should it take him back there?" "Because whatever's in there has chosen it." "The patches of light?" Sapphire nodded. "Most probably, yes." "How many of them?" "I don't know." Steel glanced towards the end section of the cellar once more, then back. "But they need something to lock onto, don't they?" he said. "I mean, I can't imagine pictures being hung or rhymes being said in a house that isn't even built." "All the same, they must be in there." Steel looked steadily at Sapphire for a moment. "Right," he said, turning back to face the end section. "Let's locate them." "Rob?" Sapphire's voice spoke from out of the night, from the cellar, from the house that he was no longer in, no longer part of. "Yes," Rob answered, glad of the sound of the voice in this lonely place. "Those patches of light, Rob?" Sapphire tried to make it sound as casual as possible under the circumstances. "Remember them?" "Yes." Then there was a pause, and Rob waited anxiously to hear the voice again. "Well, they're probably in there with you, Rob." Rob swallowed hard. "Rob?" Sapphire's voice called quickly, urgently. Yes, I heard," said Rob. He moved his head to look around him at the darkness. "So, therefore, we must find them, Rob. We must find those patches of light." "Find them?" For a moment, Rob thought that he would be asked to search for the patches of light. He experienced a cold feeling of fear. Sapphire's voice rang out again. "So I'm going to make them appear, Rob." "Oh!" replied Rob, swallowing hard once more but feeling slightly relieved. "Now, when you see them," Sapphire's voice continued with its instructions, "just tell us. Call out quickly and give us their locations from where you are. Understand?" "Yes," said Rob weakly. The cool sound of Steele's voice penetrated the thin, high sound of the wind. "Any moment now, Rob." Rob waited, feeling like someone who was fixed to a spot, fixed there forever. His mind was filled with a jumble of thoughts. Perhaps this was the time corridor thing, this place, a nowhere place. Perhaps he was to be left here now. Perhaps it would never be mornings and never be night again. Perhaps it would always stay like this, the very same time. So therefore he would never feel hungry, never feel tired, never feel anything but this strange sense of isolation, of not belonging. Perhaps it would be like that for him forever. Then Sapphire's clear eyes, like a bright but cool summer sky, seemed to appear before him, as if the look from those eyes was capable of spanning time and distance. And he felt suddenly better. Those eyes were relaying a kind of message, like a signal, like a flag of recognition. Then he saw the first patch of light appear. Rob turned his head quickly. The patch of light was glowing faintly, as if trying not to be seen. It was situated in the spot where he had last seen the false image of his father. "It's here!" shouted Rob. Steel saw the patch of light glowing in the darkness at the end of the cellar. With eyes opened, Sapphire stood trance-like, facing the end section. "Yes, I see it," called Steel. "Stay still." As he spoke, another patch of light flickered and glowed in the far corner where the dark figure had once stood. "And another one!" Rob's voice called out. "Just behind me. Can you see it?" "Yes, I can see it. Now, do you remember the patch of light that trapped Sapphire?" "Of course I do," Rob's voice replied. "Fine." Steele's face was tense. "Now, that patch of light got into a picture." Then, before Rob could answer, "Now look quickly, Rob. Tell me what those two patches of light have chosen. Tell me now." Steele waited. Nothing, Steel, was Rob's eventual reply. Nothing? No, well, nothing that means much. Tell me! Steel almost shouted the words. Hounded by Steele's questions, Rob seemed to have forgotten most of his fear. Well, one's on some earth, and the other one, well, that's on a piece of stone, an ordinary piece of stone. There was an angry, disappointed look on Steele's face. He relaxed slightly and was about to turn to Sapphire. Wait. Sapphire's eyes were still open wide, still concentrating. Steel looked at her and waited. There's another one, said Sapphire. A third one. Steel turned to look. The third patch of light glowed and pulsated as it struggled in its effort not to be seen. It was at the bottom corner of the cellar's end wall, flush with the floor, the flickering light shifting under the old, decayed plaster of the wall. Out in the open air, in the small piece of time that Rob was trapped in, the third patch of light glowed in the corner of the foundations. It shone inside one of the few stones that had been laid. It was the very end stone, the corner stone. He called out to tell Steel. Then he stared at the pale luminosity of the stone. Figures and letters had been etched into its rough surface. Leaning forward, with his feet still fixed firmly in place, Rob tried to read what had been carved into the stone. No, Rob, Sapphire's voice spoke to him. Leave it to me. Steel waited as Sapphire closed her eyes and concentrated on the stone. It's a name, she said, as Steel watched her. Someone named Jed. Jed Mace. The 2nd of February, 1736. Jed Mace. Steel stared towards the third patch of light. The man who built the house, Sapphire said, her eyes still closed. The stone was the first one to be laid, the writing on it. It's a kind of grace note. Steel watched the 3 patches of light that trembled and glowed in the dark section of the cellar. Like small animals that had been cornered, they seemed to be nervously waiting, but gave the impression of being much more dangerous because of that. How much time? Asked Steel. Time? Where Rob is now. How much time was used up until that stone was laid? Eyes still closed, Sapphire centred her mind on the stone. Half a day, she murmured, as if echoing the voice of someone from long ago. Hard work. We worked hard, all of us. But half a day. Yes, a good half a day. Then Sapphire opened her eyes, and the patches of light faded. It's made 2 mistakes, said Steel quietly. What are they? No one builds houses backwards. Steel looked around him and at the ceiling above him, and it came in at the top, didn't it? The gable. Yes, Sapphire nodded. The last piece of the house to be built. And its second mistake was in letting its offspring hide in there, in that stone. Sapphire looked towards the dilapidated plaster of the end wall. The first piece of the house to be built. Yes. Steel studied the cellar wall for a moment or two more, then turned to walk back along the passageway. Think you can take time back half a day? He asked, without turning. Glancing first towards the end section, Sapphire moved quickly after Steel. Of course I can take it back half a day. Good, said Steel as he walked, because we're going to bring it down. Sapphire stared at him. Bring it down into the time it's chosen. So how do we get it down here? Sapphire asked. Steel halted in the cellar passageway. Turning to look at Sapphire, he said, We'll give it the next nursery rhyme, shall we? Then, before Sapphire could reply, he added, All we need is someone to act as bait. Sapphire stared at him yet again, but Steel was walking again, making his way towards the cellar steps. "I'll leave you to choose an appropriate rhyme for her," he called back. Helen stood on the second landing like somebody who was being rehearsed. She faced the stairs, her back to the cupboard stair door. Then, as if on cue, Helen began to recite. "This is the house that Jack built," she said, in a child's steady monotone, as she walked towards the head of the opposite stairs. "This is the malt that lay in the house that Jack built." Helen began to descend the stairs. "This is the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built." The cupboard stair door flickered into life as the small figure of Helen disappeared below the ridge of the stair. "This is the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built." Like a flutter and a rustle, like blankets shaken busily from a window, the fabric sound began to grow in volume as the cupboard stair door began to glow. Helen's frail voice drifted back from the stairs. "This is the dog that worried the cat that killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built." The jumbled sounds and the shapes began to jostle and spill through the very structure of the cupboard stair door. As Helen stepped slowly down the flight of stairs, the reflected light poured onto the walls of the landing above her. "This is the cow with the crumpled horn that tossed the dog that... Helen forgot the words. She stopped on the middle step of the stairs and tried to remember them. It was difficult, and so she sat down on the step to make remembering easier. Steel waited at a halfway point in the cellar. His face was ashen once more, and his eyes seemed fixed as he stared ahead and waited. Peering closely at Steel's pale face, Led seemed satisfied. The freezing air that surrounded Steel did not seem to trouble the big man as he took his place beside Steel and waited. Helen remembered the words. "Oh, yes," she said to herself, but remained sitting on the step so that she could get the words in the right order inside her mind. The light had filled the landing above. It now began to trickle and spread down the stairs above and behind Helen. "Helen!" It was a whispered shout from Sapphire on the landing below. "Come on, Helen!" Smiling, as if it was a kind of party game, Helen stood up. "That tossed the dog that worried the cat," she said as she began to descend the stairs once more. "That's it. That's fine," said Sapphire encouragingly. And Helen smiled yet again as the light spread itself out upon the staircase wall and the shapes and figures loomed up and then down onto the steps of the stairs. "That killed the rat that ate the malt that lay in the house that Jack built." Pleased with her effort, Helen reached the landing and began to move across it as Sapphire eased herself backwards towards the next flight of stairs, waving Helen on as she did so. "This is the man all tattered and torn that kissed the maiden all forlorn." "Helen!" Sapphire looked up. There was a dark figure on the stairs above, a shape that stood with its head lowered and its face turned away, long hair hanging down. "Come back up the stairs, Helen." "Don't listen," urged Sapphire. "Time for bed." But Helen stopped reciting the rhyme. She halted on the landing and looked directly at Sapphire. "Do you hear me, Helen?" the voice insisted. "You won't have a kiss good night." Sapphire looked up at the dark figure. "Don't look back, Helen," she whispered urgently. "Please don't look back." "Helen!" But Helen was still looking at Sapphire. "It's not Mama, is it?" she asked. "No," said Sapphire with relief. "This is the priest all shaven and shorn," Helen seemed to have forgotten the incident already, "that married the man all tattered and torn," she chanted happily as she began to descend the last flight of stairs. "It's coming, Steel. It's coming down." Sapphire's words entered silently into Steel's mind. He moved his head stiffly and looked along the cellar towards the distant steps. Led also turned to look. They heard the footsteps of both Helen and Sapphire descending the stone steps. "This is the cock that crowed in the morn," Helen's voice echoed thinly through the cellar. Wait the priest, all shaven and shorn." Led watched as Sapphire appeared at the entrance end of the cellar. Beyond her, the tiny figure of Helen struggled on with the rime and the sudden darkness of the cellar. Then that darkness seemed to be eased slightly as the glow spilled in from the hallway and down the cellar steps. The fabric sound, too, increased in volume now, so that Helen's voice could no longer be heard. Led watched her as she approached behind Sapphire, her child's mouth still uttering the words of the rhyme that no one could hear any more. "We're giving it the whole house," shouted Led over the sound. Sapphire hurried towards him, holding on to Helen's hand now. The bright glow made silhouettes of their shapes. "Yes, the whole house," Sapphire shouted back. Steel turned to face the beams and the dark end section of the cellar. "Well, there's no way out from this cellar," Led complained. "Not for us, no," said Steel as he walked towards the beams. Rob would never be quite sure of exactly what did happen, but he heard, as he waited in the darkness, the fabric sound, and had thought for one frightening moment that the thing from the attic room was travelling across the surrounding fields towards him. Then there was a blast of icy cold air, and Steel appeared beside him on the foundations of the house. Steel was followed in turn by Led, then Sapphire, who was holding Helen by the hand. "It's all right, Rob." Sapphire had smiled warmly as she reached out for Rob and pulled him to her. And Rob felt himself holding on to her with the passion and the need of a small child. "It's all right," she said again. "It'll be gone." "Gone?" Rob exclaimed, still holding her tightly, his head pressed hard against her. "Yes, through that stone," he heard her say, "before this house was ever built." Then Rob heard the sound as it rumbled and shrieked towards them, but it did not seem to matter any more. Even when the sound roared and tore at his mind and his nerves, and the light poured out onto the foundation slabs and seemed to engulf them in the kind of glowing sea, it still did not seem to matter. Not now. And he peered through narrow eyes as he heard Sapphire say, and he could swear to this day that it was inside his head, "Because there will be no stone." Then he heard the shrill shriek as Steel drove the other patches of light into the stone. And then there was a high, fierce roar, like the mother cry of an animal. And he saw Steel touch the stone with both hands. And as the stone frosted and turned to ice, the shrill cries rose in pitch. Then the whole mass of light spun and twisted into the stone. As it did so, Rob saw Led reach down and tear the large stone from its base. Led squeezed the stone as if it were a block of salt. And the last thing that Rob heard, as Led crushed the stone to fine powder, was the high, terrifying screams of the mother light and its offspring. And the light also faded as the beams and walls of the cellar seemed to spin and twist into view. Rob ran to the top of the cupboard stair door and onto the landing. Moving quickly, he pushed open the attic bedroom door. The rocking chair was rocking, but there was no one sitting in it. There was only Helen in the room, and she was sitting on the bed, an expression of shock on her young face. "No," said Rob to himself, "please, no." He walked quickly back to the door and looked out. Steel and Sapphire were standing on the landing. Led sat on the stairs behind them. Rob stared open-mouthed. Steel was holding the teddy bear. With no expression on his face whatsoever, Steel handed the teddy bear to Sapphire, who smiled and held it out to Rob. "Sorry," she said, "we forgot something." Still staring, Rob took the teddy bear from her. He looked at them, unsure, then walked back into the bedroom. Rob handed the doll to Helen, who reached out and took it. As she did so, the doll changed position in her hands, as if her very movement itself had slipped like a gear. And then there were sounds in the room. Helen was laughing. Rob's mother was sitting in the rocking chair. His father was sat in the usual place. Rob stared at them. So penetrating was the look that the laughter and the storytelling stopped for a moment. "What's wrong, Rob?" asked his mother. "Nothing," said Rob. But his mind was full of the thoughts of a blueness and of a smile that was like a cool summer sky. The thought was like a kind of pain, he realised as he walked back to the door and looked out onto the landing. Helen and her father were laughing again as Rob's mother read the next rhyme, making it a kind of joke. There was no one on the landing. Rob stood there, looking out. He felt the strange pain again, and he wondered what it was, and whether or not it would be with him for always.